right. Well, this feels like a good time to get started. So I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Sarah Swisher, for our first general seminar of the spring term. So thank you all for coming out. And to give a little bit of information about Sarah's background, Sarah is an electrical engineer trained at the University of Nebraska. We're actually both Nebraskans, going back a ways. Sarah did her master's and her PhD at UC Berkeley in electrical engineering, like a few of our other faculty here. And her research currently sits at the intersection of semiconductor device physics, material science, and bioengineering as well. So she'll touch on several of those topics in her talk today. Her research is really collaborative and multidisciplinary, and she has affiliations with the Center of Neuroengineering at the University of Minnesota, Institute for Engineering and Medicine, Institute of Biosensing, and the Translational Center for Resuscitative Trauma Care.
That's right.
Lots of interesting applications of biomedical engineering. And then lastly, I'll mention that Sarah's also won some prestigious awards, the Intel Foundation, Robert Noyce Memorial Fellowship in Microelectronics, as well as the NSF Career Award. So with that, let's thank Sarah. Welcome her.
Thanks. Great. Thanks so much, Will. Thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. It's a great day outside, and I'm really grateful that you decided to not be outside in the sunshine, and instead you're going to hear a little bit about a different kind of light. We'll be talking about photonic processing. So like Will said, my sort of journey to where I am now it's been very nonlinear. I worked in industry for a few years doing board level GPS design. Then I decided to get into energy. So I worked on solar cells for a while in a chemistry research group. I learned nanocrystal synthesis and then took that back into electrical engineering and then made some flexible sensing devices that I took into the hospital. So one of the things that I have really loved about being a faculty member and an academic career is that ability to continue to reinvent myself and continue to work on new things. So like Will said, I'm from the University of Minnesota. For those of you who may not be very familiar with the University of Minnesota, we're located in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which has a metro population of about 4 million people. It's a huge campus, so we've got about 50,000 students total. And the engineering department and the medical school are both on the same campus. So I can look out the building windows and see the med school right across the street, which is fantastic for my work. In my department of electrical and computer engineering, we have about 45 full-time faculty, and that's both electrical and computer engineering side combined. And we have about 400 graduate students just in our department. And at the University of Minnesota, we have really strong connections, particularly to the medical device industry. The Twin Cities in Minnesota is known as Medical Alley for a reason. There are hundreds of medical device companies just a stone's throw away from the University of Minnesota campus. So we do have very close collaborations with many of those companies. All of the companies that I've listed here are actually headquartered in Minnesota and in the Twin Cities. So many of these you've heard of and have nothing to do with medical devices or materials. But then we've got things like Medtronic, Skywater, Honeywell, Boston Scientific, Polar Semiconductor, and 3M has been a big collaborator of mine as well. So it's a really great place to work. If any of you are interested in postdoc positions, you should talk to me. I have 2 postdoc positions open right now that are going to be posted in the next week or so. So if you're interested, come chat with me after. Okay, so when we talk about flexible electronics, the word flexible can mean a lot of different things. And so I want to sort of calibrate you to what we're going to be talking about here when we're looking at my work. So this is a silicon wafer. You can see that this is how we make traditional electronic circuits, right? You have this thing that looks like a big dinner plate and it's flat and rigid and easily breakable. And when we dice those up, we can put these individual chips into these small little black plastic packages, and that's how we build electronics, right? So if we want to get to flexible electronics, some people talk about this sort of system as a flexible system, and it is flexible, but it's what I would consider to be hybrid. You're taking these same rigid electronic devices, these small semiconductor chips, and you're putting it onto a flexible substrate. And that takes a lot of engineering work. But if we take it one step further and we make the actual circuits and the semiconductors themselves very flexible and skin-like, we can start to interface electronics with the body in a completely different way, right? Because what we found actually, through my work and through the work of many other leaders in this field, is that when the electronics are integrated directly with the skin, you can have some pretty bad materials actually, but the devices work better because there's less noise in the system. They're closely coupled to the electronic systems that you are trying to measure in the body. And so when I talk about flexible electronics, this is what I'm talking about. So thin film to me is usually, a couple hundred nanometers, maybe as thick as a micron. But we're talking about very thin and flexible devices. So in my research group, we're working on materials and the fabrication methods that it takes for these next generation flexible electronics. So there's a few examples of the projects that I've worked on here. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on today is these flexible transistors. We've also worked on these flexible smart bandage-like sensors where we actually put electrodes directly onto the skin, and we were able to provide early detection of damage from pressure ulcers. We've also worked on neural interfacing devices where we take a flexible and transparent electrode array and chronically implant it into a mouse so that we can do multimodal sensing of the neural activity in a mouse that's awake and alive. And we can see how it responds, and we can look at how different regions of the brain are activated during different activities. We're also making electrochemical sensors, so we're working on wearable sensor patches to do real-time detection of biomarkers. Our target in this application is trauma care and emergency medicine. And if I have time, I'll talk about a couple of those applications at the end. I'll try to reserve some time to do that. But what I want to focus on here is our work with flexible transistors. Okay? So I'm going to talk about two different types of photonic processing methods that we use to make these transistors. And for those of you who are not material scientists, I'll give you a short introduction to these semiconductor materials that we use. Don't worry if a little bit of it goes over your head. That's okay. I'll give that context for the people in the room who have that knowledge. So I'm going to be talking about two processes. They're both very fast, large area and high throughput processes. We're talking about making large area systems, right? And so photonic curing is a process where we actually are curing or annealing temperature or films at a very high temperature, but we can do that on a substrate that doesn't like the high temperature. So I'll show you how we do that. And then the second process is called photonic liftoff. And in this process, we're actually fabricating a device on top of a glass carrier and a polymer film. We're doing all of the fabrication with that glass carrier, and then we release the polymer film and the active devices without damaging those devices using the same tool that we used for this curing. Okay? So we'll talk about those two processing methods, and then I'll talk a bit about those sensing applications. Okay, so a short introduction. For those of you who are not familiar with oxide semiconductors, how many people in this room have taken a class where they learn about the operation of a transistor? Excellent. Okay, so most people who know about a transistor hear oxide and they think gate oxide, or they think insulator. The oxide is the semiconductor here. Okay, so a couple of seminal papers in this field back in the early 2000s. This was done by Hideo Hosono's group, and oxides have been known to be semiconductors for decades, long time, but they're usually terrible. Okay, so this was a game changer. Basically, what Hosono's group did was he figured out how to combine indium, gallium, and zinc to make an oxide semiconductor that had a field effect mobility. This is how easily electrons can move through the material. A field effect mobility that was, orders of magnitude higher than the next best thin film semiconductor material. So first they made this crystalline device. Now, the problem with this is that they had to heat this up to 1400 degrees Celsius in order to build this crystalline material. And that's not great. So about a year later, they did the same thing, but instead of heating it up and making that crystalline film, they made an amorphous film, meaning the atoms are not in that long range periodic order. They're just sort of randomly arranged relative to one another. And usually that means that electrons can't move through that material very well. They get stuck. But in this case, this material has some really unique properties, and the electron transport through the material did get worse, but it was still 10 times higher than amorphous silicon. So this really sparked a lot of interest in these oxide materials as semiconductors, and since this time, for the last 20 years, there has been intense interest in these materials, and they've been deposited using lots of different techniques. Pulse laser deposition or sputtering, and solution processing, which is what I'll be talking about. So very briefly, I want to show you a cartoon to give you an idea of why these materials are so unique. So imagine that this picture right here is, these are what are called the orbitals, but you can think of them as electron highways, okay? So imagine that if you want to flow current through this material, that electron, to flow the current, has to travel through these overlapping lobes in order to get through this material. So if you break the arrangement, if you make it amorphous, all of a sudden, these lobes don't overlap anymore, and the electrons get stuck, and they can't move through this material anymore. This is what those orbitals look like for this oxide semiconductor. Notice that instead of having this shape that looks like a tetrapod that has those legs like a jack, it's a big fat sphere. Spheres overlap really nicely. So this is what has made this material so unique and so exciting for many of us who are in thin film devices, because if they're nice and orderly, great. Those spheres overlap, the electrons can run through that. But even if you change the orientation, it doesn't matter. You can still get the electrons through. So this orbital overlap in these large spherical orbitals is what gives these devices such a unique transport property. So we typically mix these different metals, indium, gallium, and zinc, to make this oxide semiconductor. The different metals play different roles. I'm not going to go into that too much, but the material that we use primarily in my work is indium zinc oxide. So I mentioned that you can make these with a solution process, okay? A solution process is nice because instead of taking your substrate and putting it into a vacuum and trying to deposit a thin film that way, we literally just take salt and dissolve it into a solvent, and we spin a layer onto the substrate. And when you heat that up, it turns into a semiconductor. So this is what we would call our precursor solution. And you break down these precursors by adding heat. Eventually, the metal ions will grab onto some of those oxygens to form the oxide. And if you get it hot enough, eventually you get this long-range order. The problem is that this conversion to make these precursors turn into the semiconductor material typically happens at a pretty high temperature, about 400 degrees. And the maximum temperature that we can use for plastics, remember we want to put this on a flexible plastic substrate, the maximum temperature there is about 150 degrees. So here's the question. What can we do so that we can cure a semiconductor at a relatively high temperature, right? This is still lower than crystalline semiconductors like silicon or the crystalline IGZO. But how can we do this so that we can reach this temperature of 400 or 500 degrees without damaging that plastic substrate? So in my group, we've been working with this process that we call photonic curing. We worked with a company down in Austin, Texas called Novacentrix that has really pioneered this process for printed metals. And we started working with them many years ago because we wanted to find out if this same process could be used for semiconductors as well. And it turns out it can. And I want to give you a little bit of an explanation of how this works. Photonic curing is a flash lamp based process. So it's very short, about 3 millisecond pulses of light from, essentially it works like a camera flash. And in fact, the first systems that they made, their proof of concept was using a disposable film camera flash. And that's how they started developing this tool. Now they charge me like $300,000 for the tool. So I guess it got a little bit better. But what it does is it's going to get absorbed into part of this substrate, and it's going to heat a thin film to a really high temperature without damaging the substrate underneath. So imagine that this is a piece of glass, and this little silver rectangle right there is a piece of metal, a thin film metal. This is going to be the gate of our transistor. Okay? So if I have my xenon flash lamp and I illuminate the whole thing, it's only going to get absorbed in the regions of the material that have high absorption, right? That have high absorptivity. So what happens? So we can look at the temperature here. First as a function of depth here. This is going through the substrate down this way. And this figure here is going to show the temperature variation across the substrate. So I want you to see what happens when we turn this light on. As soon as we turn the light on, we start to increase the temperature here just locally, right where this metal gate is. So you can see the temperature reaches a peak, and then when the light comes off, the temperature decreases again. So this is what we call a non-equilibrium thermal process, because the whole substrate is not reaching the same temperature. You're actually getting localized heating in the region of that metal absorber, and you're not getting heating of the whole substrate underneath. Right? So this is what makes photonic curing so unique and so useful, because we can just heat the region of the material that we want to, and we can keep the heat away from the other regions. So those metal gates, that little metal gate right there, is going to work as an optical absorber. And when it absorbs the optical energy and turns it into heat, it basically works like a little micro hot plate. And it's going to heat the semiconductor that's sitting on top of that gate. So if any of you have taken classes in semiconductor and microelectronic fabrication, you know that there's all this work that goes into self-aligned structures, beautifully self-aligned structure, right? Okay, so if we look at the depth here, again, this is looking through the depth of this glass substrate in this case, and what you can see is that up here at the top, you're reaching about 450 or 500 degrees right at the surface of that gate, and you do actually get a little bit of heat that's coming down into the substrate. And you would think that that would cause a lot of problems. But as it turns out, we've got enough of the substrate down here that stays very cool, right? This is about 30 degrees back here. So that is going to actually stabilize the top part of this substrate so that it can actually exceed its working temperature for a short period of time without damaging that substrate. Okay, so the thin film at the surface gets heated while the substrate stays very cool. This is like the defining feature of photonic curing. Not all pulse light processing is the same, okay? It's apples and oranges if you look at a different type of heating system, and this is why. Okay, all right. So this is a picture of one of the indium zinc oxide thin film transistors, or TFTs, that we've made. So here is the cross section. You can see this is the molybdenum as the bottom gate. That's a molybdenum because it's got a really, really good absorption. So it's going to absorb that energy, and it's going to heat this blue layer. That's my semiconductor. And after I've done the heating, I process that semiconductor and I deposit my source drain on top. And we can make transistors this way. So one of the things we found that it makes a really big difference what you use for that metal. So for example, this plot right here is showing, for the same illumination, what is the temperature if we have molybdenum as that gate versus aluminum as that gate. Same amount of light, right? But what happens is the aluminum is a beautiful reflector. And so the light doesn't get absorbed, it just gets reflected off and you don't get any heating. So you have to have a really strong absorber in that gate. And the other thing that matters a lot is the substrate. So here's another plot. Now both of these are going to be that molybdenum as this top absorber layer. But now we can say, well, I can put that molybdenum on glass, which has a low thermal conductivity. And I can see that I reach this temperature of about 500 degrees. The same molybdenum, the same size, the same illumination, if I put that onto a silicon substrate, I can't even reach 100 degrees. Why? Because that optical energy is now getting sucked into the silicon. Silicon is a great thermal conductor. So it sucks away the heat, and it doesn't stay up at the top. So that for the same amount of energy that you deposit, You're spreading that energy out. It doesn't get stuck at the top, so you can't heat it up as much. Okay? So this is all about engineering the materials in the stacks so that you keep the heat where you want it. That's how photonic curing works. So one of the great things about the tool that we have is we can design what we call micro pulses. So this is actually the lamp turning on and off, on, off, with about 1 microsecond resolution. And by doing that, we can create these thermal dwell time, basically, where we stay at about 500 degrees for 2 milliseconds. So this would be 1 pulse, and then we can repeat that. Here I'm showing all of this contains this whole pulse, and we can do that multiple times. So when we did that, I'll show you what it looks like compared to a control device, which is our thermally annealed devices. So on the left here, we have TFTs that were made in a traditional tube furnace. So that takes an hour at 500 degrees. And remember, that's equilibrium. So everything reaches 500 degrees. In contrast, photonic curing took only 30 milliseconds, right? And it was heating the semiconductor to about 500 to 590 degrees. But the rest of the device underneath was staying cool. And you can see, for those of you who are familiar with oxide semiconductors, this is my XPS showing the binding of the metal to the oxygen versus the metal to the hydroxide group. And you can see that as you heat up the substrate to higher temperatures, we know that hydroxide peak goes away. We see exactly the same thing happening here as we increase the number of pulses that we're giving to that film. And so increasing the pulse number gets rid of that hydroxide peak and gives me that high quality semiconductor that I want. And we end up with a mobility that's actually higher in our photonically cured transistors than in our thermally annealed devices. And mobilities of about 20 are pretty decent. They are not record setting, but they are certainly, on par with what people are seeing in these solution processed oxides. So they actually outperform our thermally annealed devices, and they do that while reducing the curing time by about 5 orders of magnitude. So this is super exciting, but right now, these devices are still on glass. We have made transistors on plastic as well. There are other challenges that we're dealing with those. The performance is lower. We get mobilities of about 4 instead of mobilities of 20, but we're still working on that part. So one of the questions that we had is, does the shape or size of the device matter, right? Remember that we want to do this for large area circuits. One of the things that's nice about flexible electronics is you can make large area devices to interface with the body, or you can make sensors that can be used throughout a room or over a surface. And so we want to be able to cure devices of lots of different geometries, and we want to be able to do that with the same pulse. And we found anecdotally that when we made smaller devices, it seemed that they weren't getting as hot. And so we wanted to design some experiments to study this. And so we took our TFT structure here, and we modeled it in COMSOL. So this is the glass substrate. Here is that gate absorber. And we developed this 3D model using the heat transport equations to figure out how the heat is transported in 3 dimensions when we deposit this optical energy on the top. And it turns out that there is a huge difference in the peak temperature that you reach when you have a different size or a different shaped gate. And this had never been predicted before, because up until this time, all of the models that were being used to tell you how hot your device was getting were one-dimensional models. They looked just through the substrate this way, and they assumed that you had these blanket continuous layers, right? And it turns out that it's really important to look at the size and the shape of these devices. So here is a plot showing aspect ratio of 1, so squares versus rectangles, and area increasing going from here to here. And you can see that as a device increases in area, the peak temperature goes up. And as you move from a rectangle to a square of the same area, the temperature goes up. So a square is going to get hotter than a rectangle if it has the same area, okay? And what we can see here is that by changing the area, so going from blue, red, yellow, green to purple, you can see that we're increasing the total area of that absorber. And then these are 3 different aspect ratios. You can see that the maximum temperature might be 200 or it might be 450. For these materials, that is the difference between a device that is phenomenal and a device that is not a semiconductor at all and doesn't work at all. So we designed this experiment specifically to cover this range so that we could show this effect that we were observing anecdotally. So what we see is with this 3-dimensional model, we can show the non-uniformity across the gate. So notice we've got a hot spot in the middle. A 1-dimensional model doesn't show you that. A 1D model tells you that everything here is the same temperature, which is not true. So when you design your device, you need to know where to put that channel. The other thing that we can see is we can see the heat as it goes down through the substrate this way. And we can look at this as a function of these different areas and aspect ratios. So you might wonder why we get this temperature gradient around here on the corners. Why do we get cooler corners, right? Why does size actually matter? And you can think of it this way, right? If you are sitting at the middle of this square, right, there's going to be a temperature gradient between here and this cool region out here. And we said that the reason for that temperature gradient is because only the square is absorbing the light. The substrate we have selected so that it doesn't absorb much light, so it's not going to get hot. So you know you have a temperature gradient, and we know that heat always flows from hot to cold. So we know that there's going to be a gradient of heat, right? There's going to be a flux of heat flowing outwards from here. So the larger this is, the farther you are, right, from the middle to the cool zone, right? And if you're farther away from that cooler zone, essentially you're going to be able to heat to a hotter temperature before the light turns off. And so we modeled that, and this picture is showing the flux, and what you can see is there's very little flux or heat flow here in the center because it's almost the same temperature. There's very little delta T, so you get very little flux. But right here at the boundary, each of these vectors is showing the direction and the magnitude of the heat flux. And so we can see that the magnitude of these vectors is huge right at this boundary where we get that big change from the gate to the substrate. And in particular, if you look at the edge versus the corner, notice how much more flux there is from the corner. So we can explain why this area and why the shape matters by looking at this simulation of the flux. So then we wanted to validate this model, so we actually fabricated devices. These are pictures of the TFT gates themselves. So we did a lot of work to try to figure out how we can design the transistors so that the transistors themselves have the same dimensions, even though the gates are going to have vastly different dimensions, so that we don't see changes in the device performance just because of channel sizes and things like that. So this is a picture of the gates. We deposit the semiconductor, we cure it, we build the device on top, and then you can see these are our 3 large probing pads, and the active devices are inside those squares there. And what we can observe is that if we look at our transfer characteristics, we can see that we have a little bit of hysteresis, but not much. These devices are turning on at a negative voltage, which is very common for these oxide semiconductors. But for this device, this is sort of an example of a device. This was a square gate with an aspect ratio of 1 and 25,000 square micron area. And the temperature that this gate reached was about 400 degrees C. So very little gate leakage and pretty low hysteresis. So these are well enough performing devices that we can start to look at the change in performance and see how it correlates to the change in area. So what we saw on the left here, these are our thermally annealed devices, okay? So notice the temperature of each of these groups of TFTs is given across the top here. So of course, these are all going to be 500 degrees because that was a thermally annealed temperature. So we don't expect to see any difference here. These should be all not changing as a function of their gate area. On this side, Changes in aspect ratio and changes in area produce a change in the temperature, and that is producing a change in this field effect mobility. Okay? So what we see in our control sample is that we don't have any observable pattern. And that's really good, because what that's telling us is that we properly designed those transistors such that the different, we kept the channel lengths the same, we kept the overlaps the same, so that it's not geometry. It's not the geometry of the device that is causing this difference, right? We can rule that out. And instead, what's causing this difference is that the mobility going up with the increase in gate area is essentially a function of this temperature going up, right? Not of any parasitics that are inside the device. Okay. So the other thing that we used to help validate this model was the interrogation of the bonding environment or the chemical structure. And so this is that XPS data again, for those who are familiar with this. The purple getting big is good. Or excuse me, the purple getting big is bad. This is where it starts. So off that gate, even though it sees that same photonic curing pulse, it's not getting converted. It's staying in this hydroxide form. And then as we increase the area here, the maximum simulated temperature goes up, and we see an increase in this oxide fraction, which is exactly what we want. So the larger area causes it to be heated more, which means we get more of this metal oxide conversion. So both the transistor performance and this measure of the chemical conversion, those are both confirming this 3D model that says, yes, area matters. Yes, the design of the gate geometry matters. So this is the first time that this was shown. Here's just a short subset of the devices. So this is aspect ratio 1. These are squares. These are rectangles, and each column has the same area. So you can see pretty clearly that by decreasing the area here, the temperature is going down, and by going from a rectangle to a square, your temperature is going up. And that corresponds to both the mobility getting higher as the temperature goes up, which is exactly what we expect, and the threshold voltage becoming more negative as the temperature goes up, which is also exactly what we expect for these materials. Okay, I'm going to skip this comparison of all these different IGZO materials, except to highlight a couple of things. If you look at the peak semiconductor temperature and the peak substrate temperature, for all of these other processes, they're the same, right? Photonic curing allows us to process the semiconductor at 400 while the substrate stays at about 120 or lower. The other thing about photonic curing is that it's compatible with flexible substrates. It's compatible with large area deposition and fabrication as well, which is great. And then you can see that it's on par in terms of performance with these other devices, right? Not the best, certainly, but if you factor in this substrate temperature, this is really important for some applications such as flexible and also back end of line. Okay, so I want to talk now about a separate process that we use. It uses the same tool. It's the same fundamental idea, but we're going to literally flip it on its head and use it in a slightly different way. So now, instead of curing the semiconductor by shining the light onto a metal and having it act like a little microheater, what we're going to do is use this as a lift-off method. So there's a lot of people who want to fabricate devices on a polymer film, so you can actually just spin coat a polymer layer onto glass, and then you can fabricate your devices on top of that polymer film. And the glass is really nice because it gives the device stability. And if you have a really nice way of peeling off that plastic layer when you're done, then you can make much, much higher resolution devices. It's much more repeatable. You can get much higher performance out of your transistors. But the problem is that the plastic temperature, like we said, it varies a lot with the type of plastic. but it's typically about 150 or so degrees. And the reason for that is because the plastic's thermal expansion is totally different than the glass, and you get a lot of film stress and things like that. And it's very different than the materials that you have on top as well. Okay, so can we come up with a way that stabilizes, basically use the glass to stabilize this device while we fabricate it, and then really easily release it later on? So what do? Well, we have this structure here, and all we're going to do is before we spin on this polymer film, we're going to deposit what we call a light absorber layer. This is our LAL, light absorber layer. And it's just a metal coating over the whole piece of glass. That's all it is. Okay? Then we're going to deposit our polymer film, build our transistor, do all the stuff. And then if I take that thing and I flip it upside down, and here's my illumination now, and I'm going to illuminate from the bottom through the back of that glass substrate. That illumination is going to get absorbed in this metal light absorber layer, just like it was absorbed in the metal gates. But now, if that metal is a blanket layer everywhere, it means the light is never going to hit my device up here. It's all getting absorbed in this light absorber layer. So I don't have to worry about the light heating up my device anymore. It's done. Right? It's not going to get changed anymore. So what it's going to do is going to get absorbed in this light absorbing layer, heat the interface of the polymer and that metal. Remember, it looked like this. So if I can heat that interface, I can actually ablate the polymer, turn it from a solid to a gas, right at the interface, and it's going to allow that polymer substrate to pop right off. Okay? So this illumination through the glass allows us to do that without affecting this device on top at all. So what we found is that the polymer surface where the devices sit is only going to be about 120 degrees, but this interface here is going to be about 850 or 900 degrees, and that's enough to vaporize that polymer and release it completely from the glass. Okay? So to do this, first we fabricate the glass. We use titanium tungsten as the light absorber layer. We use a polyimide spin-on as the plastic. So this is our substrate now, our lift-off substrate. And then we do whatever device fabrication you want to do. In our case, we're going to make this indium zinc oxide transistor again. Okay? So for these devices, we actually thermally annealed this indium zinc oxide, and we're working on using the photonic curing for this part as well. The performance of these devices is going to be a little bit lower because we thermally annealed these at about 350. So we expect the device performance to be lower. But what we see is that during this whole step, right, multiple layers of evaporation, lithography, deposition, etching, all of that, the device is supported by the glass substrate. So if we look at this lift-off device, what we see is that here's the temperature right at that interface. And if you look as a function of time, it rapidly drops, and here's the device layer heating up a little bit on the back side, and it reaches about 118, 120 degrees, and that's it. Okay, so this is a photo of an array of transistors. These are 60 micron channel lengths and about 500 micron channel widths on these devices. So this is a picture of the liftoff process. We actually suspend it above the processing platen with these glass slides, and you can see how easily this peels off. It just peels off right by hand. There's no pulling, and what that means is that there's no residual stress in the film, so it doesn't curl up in taco, which is really nice. And then the resulting devices are completely flexible. So here's that same transistor being rolled around a small glass rod. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this part and just show you the device results. So the black is how the transistor behaves in your transfer curve and your output curve before we do that liftoff, and the red is after the liftoff. So you can see that there's very little change before to after, and when we look at the statistics, we see the same thing. This is that mobility. So as I noted, it's a little bit lower because we use that lower temperature here. But when you look at the statistical difference between the mobility before and after the PLO, there is no difference. So what this is saying is that the fact that it reaches about 120 degrees right there at that interface is not changing these devices. And then we did some bending tests and showed that they're robust to bending around these different radii, which is great. So we have these nice flexible TFTs that we were able to fabricate using that glass carrier. And this is scalable because what you're seeing here is a large glass substrate. It looks like a mirror because it's coated with that light absorbing layer. So from this direction, the film is being peeled off of that metal substrate here. And you can see that this is scalable because we can essentially move the lamp and line up the flashes of this lamp and still get really, really nice uniformity. So that big green block is showing you that you've got about 90% uniformity across that processing area there. And the other nice thing is because it doesn't rely on the polymer actually absorbing the light, all the light's getting absorbed in the metal. So what that means is it's sort of agnostic to what polymer you use. We can use polyimide or polyurethane, or this is a clear version of polyimide versus our normal sort of capped on orange looking stuff, right? And it doesn't matter that whether or not the polymer absorbs this wavelength of the light because it's all getting absorbed in the metal. All you have to be able to do is reach that ablation temperature. And we can do that with multiple different polymers. Okay, so hopefully what you can see from this is that there are some really interesting ways that we can work on processing semiconductor materials to make flexible transistors and flexible electronics. So in my group, about half of my team works on this very fundamental aspect of materials processing that I just showed you. And they're working on the semiconductors and the processing methods for those transistors. The other half of my group works more on the applications of these flexible electronics. So they don't necessarily make transistors at all, right? Most of them are making passive sensors at this point. But I want to give you a little bit of an idea of why we're so excited about flexible electronics by highlighting some of the projects that we've done, even just using passive devices, okay? So the first one is something that we call an EC shell. A C shell was developed by my collaborator, and we worked together to figure out how to get a plastic window into a frame that could be implanted over a mouse's brain. So we remove part of the skull and we replace it with this, what we call a polymer skull. And that was the first iteration of this. It was just a C shell. It was just the window. And then we said, well, what if we actually put electronics on that and we make it a sensor as well? So we used a transparent conductive material. It's called PDOT. It's a polymer that conducts electricity well. And we deposited these electrodes, and you can see them by eye, but the way that we do the absorption, or the way that we do the imaging through this, about 70 to 80% transparency, which is what these are, is sufficient so that you don't lose the optical signal to noise. So what does this do? Why do you want to look at a brain? Because mice can be genetically modified so that when a neuron fires, it actually fluoresces. So light comes out of the neuron when the neuron fires, okay? And so what this device allows us to do is to use two modes of monitoring for this neural behavior, neural activity. One is the optical method, which has really, really good spatial resolution because every neuron that fires when it emits, when it fluoresces and those photons come out, you have an image sensor, and so the spatial resolution is just limited by your imaging sensor. But the time dynamics of that are quite slow. And so the other way of measuring neural behavior is looking at the electronic signal. So electrocorticography, or ECoG, is used to measure the electronic signals that are generated when neurons fire in the brain. And so this device can do both of those things simultaneously because the electrodes are transparent, so we can actually image the cells that are right below the electrodes. And by building this thing on a flexible substrate and curving it around the brain, we were able to increase the size of this window, which is about an order of magnitude larger than anyone had been able to do before. And what that means is we're not just looking at one small region of the brain. Now we can actually look at the dynamics of multiple regions of the brain simultaneously. So I want to show you a video. This is going to look at the calcium recordings, which is that fluorescence on this side. This is looking at an animal that's awake. So as this goes from blue to red, red means there's more neurons firing in that area. Okay? These numbers indicate the locations of the electrodes, and these voltage versus time traces are the ECoG recordings from each one of those electrodes. So you can see that we can look simultaneously at the high temporal resolution and the high spatial resolution. Now this mouse is anesthetized with ketamine xylazine. Look at the difference in the shape or the activation pattern in this brain. You get these waves, right, of activation that go down from one region of the brain up here. So the different brain regions are outlined here. This is called the retrosplenial cortex right here. And we see lots of this activation right here. This is something that is commonly seen with this type of anesthesia. These are called ketamine-induced oscillations. And we can see that oscillation happening both in the electrical data and in the calcium fluorescence data at the same time. And what's really neat about this is that we're actually able to see the wave of that oscillation coming through multiple brain regions. So this is two different ways to look at the neural activity, but it is not necessarily two things looking at the same information, because different populations of cells are actually being interrogated with these different methods, which can help us to understand better what's going on in each of these two methods by looking at the two together. And this is just a picture to show that we can actually image single cells. Each one of these little colored dots is an individual neuron. These are the fluorescence traces. So each time you see this increase in that fluorescence, it means that neuron fired. And this dotted line is the electrode that's over it. And as you can see, we can clearly image the electrodes that are, or the cells that are underneath the electrodes, just as well as we can image the ones that are outside. So this large area implant allowed us to study both the individual neurons and those larger cortical networks of animals that were awake and behaving. Okay, so that's one example. Why do we like flexible electronics? Another example of a sensor system that we've been working on is a wearable sensor to measure biomarkers. So this is an electrochemical sensor. Okay. And in this case, we're working on a flexible patch-like substrate. So what you can see up here is on top of the skin, you have this flexible patch, and we have these micro needles that are coming out of the patch and actually penetrating into the top layer of the skin. So notice that they're not going very deep. The reason for that is because we want them to go into what we call the interstitial fluid. So these are cells. Here's a capillary or blood vessel. We actually don't need the needle to touch the blood. We don't want it to touch the blood. We want it to go into the space between these cells, and the needle is going to be what we call an ion selective electrode. So it's going to be functionalized so that it can detect the presence of a specific ion. Okay, in this case, we were looking at potassium. We're looking at pH, which is essentially sensing hydrogen. And so what we did is we designed this flexible bandage-like device that has these little microneedles that will penetrate painlessly and in a minimally invasive way into the top part of the skin. And those needles are coated with first a nanoporous carbon and then a molecule that's called an ionophore. And essentially what we do is we measure the voltage between this needle and a reference electrode, and that voltage is going to correspond to the concentration of the biomarker that we care about. So I worked with some collaborators in chemistry on this project, and they've been making ion-sensitive electrodes for decades, but miniaturizing them down to this needle shape was a challenge, but this is something that we published just last year. So this is actually an acupuncture needle. We decided to not reinvent the wheel and figure out how to make something sharp that penetrates the skin. So we took something that already works really well, and we put our coatings on top of it. So this is what that needle looked like once we put the carbon and the ion-selective membrane on top. And for those of you who are not electrochemists, like myself, I am not an electrochemist. What you can see here is that this sharp stair-step-like behavior in the figure on the top left. Each one of these stair steps is an addition of the potassium that we were trying to sense. So you can see that it changes very abruptly. So this is an instantaneous response. When we look over multiple sensors and we look over multiple orders of magnitude in terms of the concentration, we get the expected relationship between the voltage and the concentration. This is called a Nernstian response for those of you who are chemists. And we can see that over time, that response is very, very, very constant. It has a sort of settling period, and then it's very constant, very, very low drift. That is really important if you want to make this device into something that will do a long-term, continuous type of monitoring, which is what we're interested in here. So what we're doing now is we're taking those same needles and we're fabricating them into patches with multiple individually addressable traces here. You can see that this needle is actually sticking out of this patch here. So you can see the metal contact right up here. This is just a reflection. So we push the needle through this patch and we connect it to this inkjet printed trace here using some silver epoxy. And what we're showing more recently, I don't have the data here. We haven't published it yet. But what we're showing is that we can actually get the coatings onto the needle, and then in this patch fabrication, we can insert this thing into a skin phantom, and all the coatings stay intact. The needle doesn't pop out. And we're really excited about the preclinical studies that we're going to be doing upcoming to look at both potassium and pH with these sensors. Okay. So takeaway points, again, I just wanted to highlight two of the really interesting processing methods that we're using to make these flexible electronics: the photonic curing to anneal the semiconductors, the photonic liftoff to take it off the substrate, and then just highlight again that flexible sensors are really creating a lot of exciting opportunities. Like Will said, the research in my group is very collaborative, and this is a part that I really like. It allows me to work with surgeons, with chemists, with psychiatrists. We have a new project where we're putting sensors onto kids that have Tourette's syndrome to try to figure out if we can detect tics and discern something that is a tic versus something that is the kid just laughing or smiling, so that we can use that to give more quantitative feedback on therapies so that we can help kids with Tourette's. So lots of different ways that we can use these devices to improve people's quality of life, which is something that I really enjoy. Just want to acknowledge the members of my group, my collaborators at Novacentrics over the years, many collaborators, particularly Suhasa Kodandaramaya and Tim Ebner in neuroscience for the ECoG project, Phil Buhlman, Andreas Stein in chemistry, who helped a lot with the microneedle sensor work, as well as many of my medical collaborators in surgery, cardiology, and so on. And of course, funding agencies. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope to answer some questions.